All right, folks, I think we're going to make a start. It's lovely to see you all this evening, and a very warm welcome to UCL for this year's History Alumni Roundtable. I'm Dr Anna Maguire, I'm lecturer in Public History here in the department, as well as the outgoing chair of the External Engagement Committee, and it's my privilege to host you this evening. Returning to one's university, whether you graduated last year or it's been a decade or two, is always a fantastic opportunity to revisit your old haunts, catch up with friends and peers, and of course, to come back to your disciplinary home of history, no matter where your career has taken you. And I'll do a small shout out for our departmental tutor. If any of you fancy talking about said career to our current students, please come and say hi at the reception to Jessica. And it's with that I turn to the theme of this evening's roundtable, histories of work in a global perspective. In our current climate of tariffs, trade wars, global conflicts and immigration policies, the real-world impact on the world of work, whether the cost of living, the trade of raw materials, the supply of energy, or the travel of labour is readily apparent. And so it's my pleasure to welcome three of my brilliant colleagues to offer us historical perspective on this issue this evening. All three joined UCL this past September, and so this is also a chance to congratulate them on making it almost the whole way through their first academic year with us, and still looking nearly as fresh-faced as when they joined. Let me introduce them in turn. Dr Fabian Krautwald works and teaches on the social, political, cultural, economic and intellectual history of Africa from the late 19th to the early 21st century. He's especially interested in comparative and transnational histories, which he explores in Eastern and Southern Africa. Before coming to UCL, he held postdoctoral fellowships at Binghamton University in upstate New York and at Princeton University. And today he'll be presenting on work and migration in modern Africa, with a specific concern around precarity. Our second speaker is Dr. Alka Raman, historian of technological change in global economic history, with particular interest in import substitution and changing technologies in cotton manufacturing. Alka empirically examines historic materials and extracts data from them to inform our understanding of the early modern global past. She joined UCL from the University of Manchester, prior to which she held the ESRC Fellowship at LSE and the Economic Histories Post and Postdoctoral Fellowship in affiliation with the Institute of Historical Research at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Tonight, Alka will address work and technological change in history. Finally, Dr. Robert Suits, lecturer in environmental history. Robert earned his PhD from the University of Chicago before holding postdoctoral positions at the University of Calgary and at the University of Edinburgh. His work focuses on energy, climate, and labour. His first book, The Hobo, An Environmental History, explores how migrant work in the industrial United States develops in response to energy transitions and climate disasters. He's also the lead researcher on a wide-ranging digital history project exploring energy transitions across US history. Robert will be asking how the environment shapes work in his talk tonight on the nature of work in the industrial United States. So we'll hear from each of our panelists in turn for up to 15 minutes. I'll be keeping an eye on the time before opening up to some discussion and hopefully some time for questions from the floor. And then please join us for the short walk over to the archaeology building for a reception in their very lovely common room. And again, for that, please just follow the crowd. There'll be some stampeding historians who'll be making a direct flow for the wine. So without further ado, I hand over to our first speaker.
All right, can everyone hear me well? Great. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to this year's Alumni Day. Thank you also, Anna, for this great introduction. It's a pleasure to see you all, and I look forward to engaging with you later in the Q&A and then also at the reception. So without further ado, today I wanted to talk about work and migration in modern Africa, and specifically what African history can tell us about histories of work in a global perspective. And so as Anna intuited already, in the 21st century, the world of work has become increasingly characterized by precarity, by tenuous employment that's non-permanent, and by the need to migrate to find one's livelihood, to commute or even to move to another country, another city, somewhere else. However, historically speaking, these developments are obviously not new. They've recurred across different time periods, and specifically in the 20th century, they often unfolded first in countries of the global south, and specifically in African countries. Whereas in the 1960s and 1970s, most recently independent African nations experienced a period of economic growth and vitality. The subsequent period of the later 70s and 80s was one, in many ways, of economic collapse. This often sort of is backdated to the 1973 oil crisis, which really undermined the economic model of most of these recently independent states, and then forced them to slash spending. That often took the form of the International Monetary Fund stepping in and with sort of support of its mostly Western backers, mandating what were called structural adjustment policies, which forced these governments to cut public spending, privatize public enterprises, and also expose until recently protected industries, manufacturers, to global competition. And the result of this is what African historians still call the lost decades of the 1980s and 90s, which really resulted in and exacerbated a series of civil wars and economic decline. The losses that these decades caused in many ways were only recuperated very recently, about sort of towards 2010. And so in many ways, long before austerity reached Europe, before it reached Greece or before it reached the UK, it was instituted from Cairo to Cape Town and from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. And this kind of quick recap is just to illustrate that the history of austerity is only one of the areas in which African histories of labor and of work can help us understand the history of work in a more global perspective. At the same time, Africa also constitutes the future of work. The UN estimates that by the middle of this century, the continent will account for roughly a third of world population, or 2.4 billion people. That means to understand labor in the 21st century, we need to understand African histories of labor and of African workers. And this photo here that I included on my starting slide in many ways reflects that already sort of unfolding future of African work. And what you can see in this photo is one of the offices of the US company Sama, which are located in Nairobi, Kenya. And Sama is a subsidiary, or was a subsidiary of Meta, and as in that function would content check material uploaded by users to Facebook. And Sama has come recently into focus because its former employees have sued first Sama and then also Meta for insufficient protections of their workers because of the extremely graphic and in many ways traumatic content that they had to moderate. And so in this case, African sort of cultures and realities of work illustrate, on the one hand, right, the global growth of social media and tech companies, but also the very human component of AI training technology. And today I want to kind of expand on African histories of work regarding two examples. And the first one concerns kind of how we conceptualize work and what you might call path dependency. For much of the 20th century, the rise of an industrial working class was seen as this supposedly inevitable side product of economic development. And industrial wage labor seemed to be the future for all global economies, whether in the global south or the global north. And this is kind of neatly illustrated in this propaganda photograph from a Namibian liberation movement, which kind of called for unity and international solidarity for the Namibian workers, the two of whom obviously sort of look into a bright future of industrial and probably wage employment, and are obviously also members of a union which defends their rights. The problem with this meta-narrative of proletarianization is that it never really applied to Africa as a continent. Because, for example, by 1960s, less than 5% of the continent's workers were actually in wage employment. And at the time, that was about between 4 and 5 million workers on the entire continent. And this share remained extremely low until the 1990s. And as a result, connected expectations about development, for example, about the potential for proletarian revolution, or industrial development, also were kind of misplaced, because how are you going to achieve a proletarian revolution without an industrial working class? So there was kind of always this mismatch between realities of work on the African continent and the concepts and analytical models that were developed to describe that reality. This is also why, because the sort of small size of the industrial working class on the continent is also why politics on the continent after the sort of onset of the economic crises of the 70s often veered towards economic and political populism from the right and left. Because these newly independent states, as economic crisis hit, often sort of became more dictatorial and undermined the power of the small existing unions. And so with that, with sort of the undermining of the civil society organizations, African politics also took a turn towards populism. And in that sense, again, the decline of organized labor in African countries since the 70s illuminates broader patterns in global politics that we've seen in the global north since the financial crisis of 2008 as well. Now, conversely, there's also been a persistent myth that wage employment has not grown in Africa since the 1990s, sort of since the collapse of communism and socialism, and that Africa kind of remains the supposedly lost continent in economic development. This is patently untrue. As you can see in this graph, data from the ILO suggests that there has been a rapid rise in wage employment on the continent over the last 3 decades, which kind of illustrates the growing integration of African economies into global capitalism. And so, for example, in Kenya, wage employment nowadays accounts for 40% of all employment relationships. And in Senegal, I think it's even higher, it's at 50%. And I think as this illustrates in the example of Sama as well, this obviously means that Africa in many ways is also more exposed to shifts in the global economy, but also that African workers are gaining more opportunities to contest their exploitation and marginalization. So for example, in the Sama example, they were able to sue Meta in Kenyan courts. Now, my second example is about mobility, and I kind of changed the topic of the talk a little bit in light of yesterday's speech by the Prime Minister. Because migration obviously has become a very controversial topic in Western democracies. There's been populist attacks against migration of all kinds. However, especially regarding African migration, there are these persistent misunderstandings and misconceptions in Britain and Europe that the majority of Africans is somehow just on the edge of their seats waiting to leave the continent. And again, this is untrue, because since the 1960s, it is very clear that intra-migration within the African continent is numerically much larger and has remained much larger than out-migration. So more Africans migrate within the continent than leave it towards Europe or other regions of the world. Despite this, even African scholars such as the Ethiopian Asfar Wasson Aserate have claimed that there is an African exodus and that the continent is losing its youth and its future. And we can talk about this a little bit in the Q&A. There are real concerns about the brain drain, right? The leaving of skilled migrants, which kind of leaves local economies on the continent at a disadvantage. But the most important point to take away is that this out-migration until very recently was a very negligible part of African migration. And you can see this especially in the left side of this table, where you can see that the intracontinental migration has remained extremely strong until 2019, with 185 people per 1,000 residents not living in the country they were born in. So this is what this table illustrates, what's called immigrant stocks, which measures the amount or the rate of people that live outside the country they were born in. You also see, though, that out-migration has increased. This is the second column from the left, extracontinental, and has been rising in the last 3 decades. So African migration globally is increasing, but most Africans are still migrating within the continent. Now, what does this tell us? 2 things. The first is that the consistent strength of intra-African migration shows the economic potential of the continent, and that Africans are sort of responsive to that changing potential. The major successful economic sectors of African countries, and I included just 3 here, are all related to large-scale migration flows and have been for a very long time. The first one is one of the biggest success stories. It's cocoa in Ghana, which was popularized as a crop by Tete Kwarshi, whose bust you can see here on the left. The second one is gold mining in South Africa, and you see here the Poneng gold mine near Johannesburg on the Witwatersrand. So South African mines are still the deepest in the world. They go down, I think, this one goes down about 2.4 miles. And the entire labor force for the Witwatersrand has been, for the better part of a century and more, has consisted of migrant laborers that come from what is today Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and other neighboring countries. And then finally, the groundnut economy of West Africa in general, and Senegal in particular, has also been fueled and staffed by migrant laborers. And not incidentally, these 3 countries, Ghana, South Africa, and Senegal, are today some of the most successful and wealthy African economies. The second point this tells us, and I'm sort of getting to my conclusion here, is that the Africans who are increasingly moving to Western countries, to Europe, to Britain, do so because of economic opportunity, yes, but also because of underlying demographic factors in European and Western societies. And you see this in this graph, which illustrates that in Western countries, which is indicated by the gray line, that the number of people of working age, which is roughly defined as people between the ages of 15 and 64, has been declining and will precipitously decline over the next couple of decades. Moreover, in the second line, the light pink one, you see that also economies that traditionally have supplied migrant labor to the global economy, for example, countries such as the Philippines or Mexico, have also become more wealthy, and as a result, fewer people from those countries are migrating. They can just stay at home. And the big difference is African economies, which, because of sort of high birth rates that have been falling for a long time, but are still globally on a higher level, that African countries will add, I think, about 700 million workers over the next couple of decades to the global economy. So the debates about migration are a little bit, you can argue obviously about the political feasibility of welcoming X number of migrants, but you can't really argue with the reality of demographic change in the West. And so in that sense, it's pretty clear that African workers will account for a greater share of skilled and unskilled labor in other economies across the world in the next couple of decades. The other thing I wanted you to take away from this is that this migration is already in an overwhelming degree legal, right? So data from Eurostat, for example, shows that of the 4.1 million people who moved to the European Union in 2023, only about 10% were irregular migrants. And there are similar numbers for the UK, where African migrants only constitute a minority of illegal entries to the country. So to conclude, at the outset, I asked what African history can tell us about histories of work in a global perspective. I argued that the Global South, and Africa in particular, offer lessons in understanding the impact and history of austerity, the decline of union politics, and the potential of labor migration to spur growth. At the same time, I noted that the absence of large-scale proletarianization on the continent should make us skeptical of any purportedly inevitable language in economic and political theory or models. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alka Raman. Thanks very much, Anna, for the invitation to present today on work in global history, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time to attend this session today. Today, I will attempt to unpack some insights that history can provide us in relation to work and technological change. I will frame it through one basic question: what did work look like for Indian and British cotton yarn spinners over time? And what can this difference tell us about the ways in which we conceptualize work and how we might adapt it, and how a technological change might be adapted over time for work? So work fulfills many roles in our lives, from providing economic means for survival to offering an avenue for self-expression. Indeed, for many of us, work constitutes our very identities. Work is also very much in the gray zone for providing economic growth on the one hand, but also ecological damage on the other. I must specify at the outset that today I'm adopting a narrow definition of work. I'm looking at it as an economic activity, a job, an occupation undertaken for financial remuneration. I will use historical evidence to argue that work and technology exist not as isolated twins, but as part of a trio of elements that must be considered together alongside the idea of human skill for us to comprehensively understand the role of changing and increasingly complex technologies and their impact on how we do and how we organize our work. I talk of changing technologies very consciously. As we grapple with big technological change on the horizon, we inhabit a world that is both excited by and petrified of artificial intelligence. This is a world where work as we know it, whether mechanical or mental, is progressively being done by machines created by humans. of course reducing both time and human effort. There is increasing concern with what this shift might actually mean for the nature of work, for the vast majority of us, for the relationship between humans and how they occupy themselves socially, culturally, as well as economically. Markets and also policymakers across the globe are recalibrating their long-held views on human capital and labor, posing questions about labor obsolescence, job losses, but also rehabilitation and retraining of workforces. As we navigate towards a more machine-led phase of the Anthropocene, it is an opportune time to consider how we got here and what history might tell us about the implications of technological change, as well as our choices for the future. To do this, I dive back into some of my own work on the evolution of the cotton industry in Britain, an industry which was a pioneer par excellence, the undisputed initiator of modern economic growth in global history, and the leading transformer of the way work would forever be conceived and indeed conducted. Despite the leading role that cotton played in industrialization and therefore in global history, the story of cotton does not begin in Britain with the Industrial Revolution. Its origins lay in the heat and humidity of the South Asian subcontinent, in the alluvial black and loamy soils that grew abundant cotton in the warm tropical climate of India, and with a population that learned to tame, modify, and skillfully turn bursting cotton balls into commodities prized around the world. I am, of course, referring to the famous hand-spun, hand-woven, hand-painted, and printed cotton trade textiles from India. These textiles traveled around the globe within complex commercial networks during the early modern period, and in the process changed the face of the world. The Indian cotton textiles were prized for their exceptional artisanal quality, striking colors, and advanced production techniques. These techniques had been developed in tandem with the local ecology, the knowledge and practical expertise honed and transmitted over generations. The introduction of these sophisticated textile products into European markets created what Beverly Lemire has described as a calico craze. Unlike the woolen and linen fabrics common in Europe at the time, Indian chintzes were multicolored, lightweight, and color-fast to washing. These characteristics quickly made them popular for personal dress as well as home furnishings within both domestic and global markets. Their popularity prompted immediate responses from European manufacturers who attempted to replicate Indian chintzes domestically, initiating a process of import substitution. Now, this process of import substitution revealed two significant challenges. First, British manufacturers struggled to replicate the lightweight all-cotton cloth that Indian artists had produced for centuries with remarkable consistency over time. Surviving textiles from the period, British as well as Indian, tell us that British cloth quality evolved an impressive 99% from 1746 to 1816 to match that of the Indian benchmarks, a feat that was achieved through radical shifts in technology and in forms of work, how it was done and how it was organized, for the making of these new textile products in Britain. Second, transferring natural dyes to the fabric in a color-fast manner proved equally difficult and equally challenging. Historical reconstruction of Indian chintz making process shows that acquiring chintz making knowledge and expertise was a very complex affair. Through reconstruction, we can see the inefficiencies inherent in transferring geographically specific knowledge from one region to another. The long drawn-out process required investigations, new learning, as well as multiple adaptations, several of which constitute innovations in cloth making and printing dyeing, which we recognize today as part of the Industrial Revolution. By comparatively examining the surviving material textile sources of this time, we can identify precisely what European and British savants, artists, and entrepreneurs lacked for both cotton cloth making and cotton cloth printing and dyeing. And what they lacked was the skill to make the cloth and to print and paint the cloth the way that the Indians had done for centuries. Machines helped overcome the skill gap for cloth making, while the evolution of chemistry as a distinct field of scientific inquiry bridged the knowledge gap for printing and dyeing of cotton textiles. So the connection between work technology and skill of the worker emerges clearly when we zoom into the evolution of spinning machinery from simple to complex. In the process, it becomes clear that the spinner's skill in handling technology has always been at the heart of spinning, constituting the foundation of cloth making. From twisting fibers between thumb and fingers, or rolling fibers on thighs to produce yarn, to attaching fibers to a weight called a whorl at the other end of the spindle, thereby creating a drop spindle, spinning has always required significant skill and dexterity on the part of the spinner. Following on from the drop spindle, the spinning wheel was invented and circulated in India in the early Middle Ages. It comprises a wooden frame with a wheel at one end and a spindle at the other. The Indian spinning wheel, commonly known in Europe as the Jersey wheel, was the basic technology for spinning cotton yarn in the pre-industrial period. Its two processes, drafting, twisting the fibers, then winding the spun yarn back onto the spindle, each require well-honed skills to handle the wheel and short staple cotton fibers. The spinner's body, therefore, is a key part of the mechanism of spinning on the Indian or the Jersey wheel. In 1530, Johann Jürgen in the German town of Brunswick invented the continuous spinning wheel called the Saxony wheel. For continuous spinning on the Saxony wheel, the spinner had to take care to maintain a constant twist of yarn on the bobbin. The Saxony wheel's mechanism generates a centripetal force on the bobbin, which pulls strongly on the yarn, making it technically impossible to spin fine yarn on this wheel, irrespective of the spinner's skill levels. Fine yarn, as you can imagine, was essential to make fine cotton fabrics to compete against Indian textiles in global markets. The Saxony wheel, therefore, did not replace the Indian wheel in textile production within Europe. The two coexisted and were used simultaneously with different fibers. I've gone into the details of the working mechanisms of these early spinning apparatuses to press upon you how skill intensive they were and how much time, attention, and training went into mastering these early spinning techniques. The next round of breakthroughs in spinning following the Indian and the Brunswick wheels relate to the Industrial Revolution. Material assessment of their working mechanisms reveals that the three spinning macro inventions, the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the mule, also called the muslin wheel, were all technologically path dependent. The jenny was a straightforward development of the Indian wheel necessary to bridge the skill gap of the British labor force in order to be able to spin fine yet strong cotton warp to make the cotton cloth. It transferred the skill embedded in the fingers of the Indian spinners into the machine's mechanisms, disconnecting the feel, control, and dexterity of the spinner's fingers from the spinning process, making the spinner a basic mechanical device operator. The water frame, in the middle on the screen, based on the continuous Brunswick wheel, further distanced the spinner from the process of spinning, requiring no specialized spinning skills whatsoever. Indeed, it was routinely operated by unskilled labor. It is with the invention of the mule, the one on the right, that the two techniques of the Indian and the Saxony wheels were combined for the first time. The transfer of cotton spinning skills from the hands of Indian spinners, predominantly women, to the machine, which was predominantly operated by men in Britain, beginning first with the jenny and then solidified by the water frame, now acquired a new dimension with the mule. It demanded a new skill in the machine operator, and the skill was that of astute mechanical ability to navigate the intricacies of the yarn-making process on the mule by operating larger and more complex machines. While operating the mule required physical strength and mechanical ability, the spinner's skill in the form of dexterity and intimate knowledge of the fibers and the spinning mechanism had been successfully removed from the spinning process. As mule workers, extremely skilled and indispensable machine operators that they had now become, demanded better wages and working conditions. For the first time in human history, industrial leaders commissioned themselves a mechanical invention with the explicit purpose of replacing labor, which led to the invention of the self-acting mule in 1825. This episode puts the issue of skilled labor front and center within debates around technological change. All of this to return to our basic question: what constituted work for spinners over time, especially in the Indian and the British contexts, and what can this tell us about technological change and its impact on the nature of work? Indian spinners, typically women, were skilled artisanal makers of cotton yarn, using basic tools alongside their hands and minds as integral components of the yarn production process. To manipulate yarn, the spinner's fingers registered an instant feedback signal in the brain pertaining to the nature and quality of the twist. The spinner was then able to calibrate and execute every successive draft and twist action in line with this feedback from the brain. This method of what I have called intelligent spinning, because the brain is constantly engaged in the execution, in the actual doing of the spinning, could produce any yarn count commissioned as long as the spinner, through training and investment in countless hours of experience, had developed sufficient skill to manipulate the yarn in a tightly controlled environment, one hand moving the wheel, the other drafting, twisting, and winding on, engaging body and mind in a constant feedback loop. In the British context, on the other hand, the artisan was commonly a male mule operator, a mechanic, as well as an assessor of yarn quality. The machine required periodic calibration in order to spin different counts and to ensure it was working properly. The spinner's knowledge and skill in setting up the machine to achieve this calibration was indispensable. The actual spinning was done by the machine, and since the spinner was not using his hands to do the spinning, the constant feedback loop with the mind functioned slightly differently. The spinner had to watch and assess the quality of the yarn being spun, look out for irregularities or broken parts, and at the same time be aware of the machine's mechanical operations. The nature of skill had changed with technological change, as had the nature of work. Indeed, the very meaning of the word spinner itself had altered entirely. So to conclude, examination of the crucial phase of mechanization in global history through the lens of the precocious cotton industry in Britain therefore tells us that technological innovations were aimed at improving product quality, which is a function of the skill of the labor force as well as the techniques deployed. Histories of labor and skill are therefore central to our understanding of innovations leading to technological change of the kind we are now facing and of the variety that leads to economic growth. The case of technological change in the cotton industry highlights that specialized technologies require specialist training for the acquisition of specialist skills. Historical evidence from the cotton industry tells us that upskilling of the labor force is crucial for overcoming labor obsolescence while maintaining positive economic outcomes. With a large body of historical evidence now at our disposal regarding the flip side of economic growth, it also points to the role of the state in regulating technological change for sustainable and socio-economically as well as ecologically prudent technological change-led growth strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Anna, for chairing, and thank you to Fabian and Alka for those wonderful presentations. So few prophecies have been made so frequently, and few have failed as spectacularly and consistently as the fabled end of work. From the Industrial Revolution to the present day, our ability to build machines that can convert other forms of energy into useful work have prompted people across the political spectrum, both left and right, from Marx to present-day libertarian gurus about artificial intelligence, to predict that industrialization will somehow end toil. What I'd like to speak about tonight is a particular episode in what has been this nearly century-long debate about the potential of energy and the potential of technology to solve all of our work problems and to give us a wonderful post-scarcity economy. And in particular, I'd like to take a look at the way that energy shaped work in the late 19th century and early 20th century United States, a time and topic explored by my first book. And it's a time when work is being reshaped by a series of energy transitions in what are really some unexpected and fascinating ways, and what all of these stories can tell us about the larger history of work. Now, the people at the time assumed that steam engines would reduce the work of the entire population, that steam technologies would essentially slowly start to take over pretty much everything else in the economy. But steam engines, it turns out, did not replace older technologies at all. So if we start to look at how people have used energy over time across various sources across the United States, and you look at the era when steam engines were fairly prevalent, right up until about the 1920s, you can see that in, for example, the agricultural sector, steam engines aren't making a dent. And of course, we know this. There are no large steam tractors kind of trundling around a 19th century farm, if you're picturing it. But this is also true in various other places, all throughout the economy. So the transportation sector as well, of course, develops these massive steam railroads that are moving all across the country. But for both freight and passengers, pretty much all last mile transportation also had to take place on horseback or being drawn by horses. Every single facet of the economy where the steam engine started to expand was paralleled by a similar expansion of the animal technologies alongside it. If we look at per capita numbers, we'll see that they stay relatively steady in agricultural use. If we look at absolute numbers, we'll find that the number of horses in the United States grew from roughly 1 million around the year 1800 to 20 million by 1900. And as I'll talk about in a second, actually just talking about the number of the horses actually understates by a considerable amount the impact that they have. So this is kind of the first misconception that we need to correct about how energy and work interact. This idea that the arrival of new technologies replaces old ones. For a lot of technologies, with the case of steam and with the case of animal muscle, but also in the case of other energy technologies as well, new technologies actually end up amplifying older ones. And we can go quite a bit deeper than that if we look at one of these specific examples. So this is juxtaposing two pieces of farm equipment from 1900 in kind of the peak era of steam technology, and in 1954, long after it ends. And the one on the left is a steam thresher. So if you're not familiar with how your bread comes to be, basically it starts out as these nice stalks of wheat in a field. You have to reap them, you have to bundle them into these giant bundles of stalks, then you have to somehow throw them into the air and separate the wheat from the chaff. That is where the expression comes from. And for a long time, people mostly did this by hand, just throwing things into the breeze and trying to get all of the wheat kernels, which are heavier, to separate out and all of the chaff to blow away. But towards the end of the 19th century, they start to invent technologies that can do it for them, specifically the steam thresher. Now, a steam thresher basically operates by having, you rent a steam engine from either one of your neighbors or from a larger company, you pull it into the middle of your farm, you load this giant stack of grain next to it, and you feed it piece by piece into the steam thresher. It blows it up, and you gradually start to separate the grain from the chaff. But what you might notice about it is that the steam thresher is not necessarily doing very much of the work. Because if you'll notice one of the big differences between these two pictures, the steam technology is accompanied by this cloud of migrant workers and a couple of horses too. It's just completely surrounded by muscle and by muscular systems and biotechnologies on all sides. Whereas later technology generally does not so much. And the net outcome of this for human beings is surprisingly staggering. So migrant workers in the American West happen to have arisen right around the same time as the first caloric studies of human bodies were run, which means that we actually have pretty good estimates of what their work actually looks like. Which is to say that the average worker in one of the industries heavily employing migrant labor burns somewhere upwards of 5,000 to 8,000 calories a day. That is to say that the average lumberjack or the average harvest hand burns the same amount of calories as an Olympic athlete would in the present day. Nor was this trend limited to the humans in these workplaces. If we look instead at various horse manuals and collate the ones from all sorts of farmers trying to track how much they're feeding their horses, whether they're working, whether they're not working, we can see that between 1800 and 1900, they eat about 50% more fodder, and they're also about 50% physically larger and more muscular. The average horse around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. So let me reiterate that. Migrant workers burned twice as many calories on a daily basis as the average person had a century prior, and about twice to 3 times as many as we do today. The horse that they worked with had grown by half again. So what we see here with the rise of steam power is not a parallel decline in manual labor. Instead, steam itself is causing an intensification in muscle power. What had effectively happened here, and this is what I really get into in my book, is that the economy had started to fracture into a couple of different pieces, all of them reliant on their own forms of energy. So any work that didn't require a particularly mobile or maneuverable source of power, anything where you could pretty much keep all of the work concentrated into a stationary point, that's what you do with a steam engine. But anything that requires a lot of power, but that power kind of needs to move around or needs to move onto soft soils, anything where a heavy engine would be a major problem, that's instead done by horses. And then there's a third tier of that economy where anything that requires fine manual dexterity or agility is done by humans. And as steam engines get bigger and more powerful, and as horses get bigger and more powerful, it means that people have to also get bigger and more powerful to keep up with the new flows of material and capital that are being unlocked by the other parts of this economy. So effectively, everything is pushing humans to work harder. This is why there starts to be a muscular intensification in the economy. Because humans are now the bottleneck on the economy. These changes extend far beyond the agricultural sector. This is just a lovely illustration. There are essentially parallel stories in every industry in the United States. Any kind of extractive work starts to look a lot more like this picture on the left, a steam engine surrounded by muscle. Then, of course, over the course of the next 20 years, this begins to change. And this is in large part because the internal combustion engine can be built a lot smaller and a lot lighter than a steam engine. Oil-derived fuels can explode inside pistons, whereas a steam engine requires heavy boiler along with pistons and solid fuels. At the very least, in a steam engine, you need a person to be just standing there shoveling the coal into the boiler manually, whereas an internal combustion engine kind of draws its own fuel from the fuel tank via liquid pressure. So you don't need a crowd of people attending to them. Instead, individual farmers essentially harvest an entire field by themselves, or plow an entire field by themselves, as you can see with this guy on the right, who is twice the man with his tractor. There's a whole subsection that we could really get into with masculinity and oil and petromasculinity, but I won't get into that right now. So the transition to an oil power economy creates a society in which many tasks that have been done by horses or humans could suddenly be done by machines, a kind of age of motorization. But this new energy transition doesn't unstack the economy. It doesn't mean that everything becomes motorized. So energy economies instead, over the course of the long term, tend to sort into different kinds of technology doing different kinds of work. So muscles don't stay there as just a kind of remnant technology, but rather they're still being amplified and redirected in new ways. So this is from some of my quantitative work. It's a fancy diagram that also looks a bit like a bowl of multicolored spaghetti, and for that I apologize. But essentially, what you have on the left here are different kinds of fuel, and what you have on the right here are different kinds of uses. And one of the things that if you start to really look at this diagram over the course of many hours or days or years, as I have, is that you start to see that like various parts of the economy tend to sort out into different kinds of fuel. So the transportation sector becomes overwhelmingly petroleum-based. The industrial sector tends to be one of the main ones using natural gas. Agriculture is now done entirely by petroleum-based stuff or by electricity. That's actually mostly through chicken farms and through other kinds of meat production. Now, what all of this kind of pulling it together shows us is that ostensibly labor-saving technologies don't interact neatly with the real world. The broader discourse around them, and I think we're seeing this again today, is that they are essentially plug and play, that we're going to invent some new type of machine which replaces human effort in some field, and then it is simply going to do that. But in fact, they collide with the reality of labor markets in very unexpected ways. One of the big problems with predictions of automation is that the people making them rarely have a good grasp on the political economy. We can see this also with the harvest workers, that there are many predictions that they're going to automate this process. There are people who are coming up with self-raking tractors that'll just clean themselves off with a little mechanical device, with self-feeding threshers. None of these actually come to fruition because it always ends up being cheaper to employ a person, and the only real purpose of these ostensibly labor-saving technologies is to suppress worker organization and to suppress wages. Rather than liberatory or apocalyptic, machines are more often used in this way to leverage power in the workplace. And then the other big problem that I see in my own work is that there are material limits on technologies, facets of how that technology interacts with the physical world, which mean that even what we see as fairly general purpose technologies aren't limitless in their potential. Things like steam are limited to the bulky and the unagile of uses. And much as the transformation of the energy economy then did not eliminate human labor, I suspect the same is going to hold true into the present day. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes for some discussion, maybe 9, if I'm feeling generous. So while you're maybe gathering your thoughts, and if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. We've heard this evening kind of papers that have reflected on what we mean by work and what work looks like in these various contexts. So whether that's waged, salaried, skilled, or unskilled, or embodied, and thinking about those muscular labourers, but also the experience of the Indian spinners. We've talked about new technologies. We've raised the spectre of AI and thought about ways in which that can be offset or challenged. Is it the end of work? Do we know? We've also talked about both the migration of labour, but also the migration of knowledge and expertise, and how different knowledge economies have tried to capitalise on and change their reliance on trade. And we've started to hint at the role of gender in work, which I think has been really interesting. The kind of contrast between the female Indian spinner and the male British spinner who's kind of monitoring, I think is really exciting. So I'm going to use my chair's privilege to start with one question, which was raised, but kind of we might want to expand on, which is the relationship between work and the environment. So it came up in thinking about kind of the extractive nature of work or ecological damage. Alka talked about, we've also seen it in thinking about different forms of energy or the use of natural resources. So maybe one question, a question-ish, form question. How are you thinking about the relationship between work and the environment in your research at the moment? who'd like to go first?
Are you asking me?
Anyone on the panel.
I can go with
Yeah.
this. I think the more I'm working on textiles, especially printing dyeing techniques, which is something I've been working on recently, I think environment comes out as one of the most significant factors, especially in the development of printing dyeing techniques. So one of the projects that I recently finished was about the transfer of, or the lack of transfer of, one particular very specialized niche technique of printing and dyeing with indigo from India into Europe. The technique was just not understood. Not understood to the extent that it was not adopted at all. In fact, so much so that it was said that this is completely incorrect, that it can't work like this, and so therefore completely glossed over. But only historical reconstruction shows you precisely why this technique works. And the reason why this technique works is because it was geographically specific. It used raw materials that would have grown within the Indian ecology, allowing for the knowledge connected specially to those specific raw materials to develop within that environment. So it's not possible to transfer that kind of knowledge from one area to another without that geographical specificity also. You would have to transfer. You would have to transfer the social norms, the cultural norms, the knowledge that has developed in that ecology.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think how does the environment shape work in so many myriad ways? I think a couple of the ways that I find really interesting in my own work are the ways that kind of the broader external world shapes our kind of working lives. So in particular, I'm interested in things like how like small-scale climate catastrophes in the past have kind of possibly ramified into people's migration patterns or into how that kind of affects the precarity of any particular employment sectors. So for a lot of the migrant workers that I'm looking at, climate disaster effectively becomes ramified through capitalist systems onto individual workers. You can really see that in their testimonials of how their own work is shaped. The other way that I think is a little more subtle and a little harder to think through maybe is in how the materiality of our world shapes our work. So by that, I mean, like with energy technologies, a huge amount of the world of coal is shaped by the fact that coal is this rock that you have to physically move around. You have to get it from place to place on railroad. You have to shovel it off of the railroad onto horse-drawn carts. You have to haul the carts through cities, stuff the coal in these bins through people's doors, where it's then physically handled by domestic servants and domestic laborers of all kinds to heat their homes. So you get these testimonies from people in 19th century Britain and 19th century United States of seeing and looking at these carboniferous fossils as they're heating their homes, because of course they are, because that's what you find in a random lump of coal. And the fact that this world becomes so dependent on manual labor and becomes so dependent on muscular power is in large part because it is really hard to move coal around, whereas of course the classic counterexample is electricity. It's something that we barely have to think about at all. We flip on a switch and we don't have to think about the fact that, you know, some coal plant like hundreds of miles away is forcing steam through a turbine and its load has to increase by just a couple of watts to like manage that new demand that has been put on by this LED light bulb that we've been flipping on. And in fact, that work is usually done by some engineer who's staring at a little gauge and trying to figure out whether to crank up or down the power plant. It's a very different experience of the environment and energy.
Yeah, so the relationship between work and the environment is sort of in my research or in African history more broadly quite ambivalent. So right in my sort of presentation, I really emphasized the positive aspects of labor migration. And sort of historically that you can sort of substantiate that within a variety of communities, societies on the African continent. For example, in Namibia, which is one of the countries I study, labor migration from the north to the South African mines, to the Witwatersrand, was associated with colonial and apartheid exploitation, yes, but also on a sort of individual, family, and household level, really enabled transformative capital accumulation that engendered new opportunities for education, and also, in many cases, the rebuilding of societies and kind of what is sometimes called environmental infrastructure in local environments after colonial conquest, right? Because colonialism obviously disrupts local ecologies, local ways of farming, engaging with the environment, and then this sort of capital that is accumulated from labor migration is often used by local societies to rebuild themselves. That being said, if anyone has ever been to Johannesburg or to South Africa, to the mining areas, they will be familiar with huge mounds, towering mounds of the remains of the mining industry, which are dotted around South Africa and which are incredibly toxic. The remains, the chemicals used in mining and in gold processing and platinum processing have, over the last century and a half, more or less, really transformed the local environment and are an environmental challenge that, in terms of necessary labor input, capital input to resolve it, is really hard to put down on a single number. There's a historian at Stanford, Gabriel Hecht, who has developed the term residual governance for this challenge, that one of the big issues for the 21st century will be how do we deal environmentally with the fallout of repeated technological changes and their purported blessings on our civilization.
Great. So you have time for maybe one or two questions if anyone has. If not, we can save them for the reception and have it in a more casual setting over a glass of wine. Okay. In which case, I will thank our three speakers for some fantastic papers this evening. So thank you once again.